Leave this house and never come back! Did you not hear me? Get out! Pack your things and leave, Ruth. You are fired.
You think you can just walk out of here after everything? You owe me, Ruth. You owe this family everything.
The morning Charles Whitaker fired Ruth Ellis, he never once looked at the woman who had saved his life. Ruth had served his family for 11 years. She had stood beside his wife during the final months of her illness. She had found Charles unconscious on the floor 18 months earlier and made the call doctors later said may have saved him. But on this freezing November morning, none of that seemed to matter. Ruth stood beneath the enormous chandelier in Charles's Connecticut mansion, with one worn suitcase beside her, and tears she refused to let fall. Around her, household employees had stopped working. Charles's daughter, Allison, stood near the staircase. His longtime attorney, Martin Shaw, watched silently from several feet away. And directly between Charles and Ruth, on a polished marble table, lay a thick folder containing enough evidence to make 11 years of loyalty look like one carefully planned lie. Nearly $4.8 million was missing from a family trust established by Charles's late wife, Eleanor, and almost every trail appeared to lead directly to Ruth. Charles looked at the woman he had once trusted with his life and believed he was finally seeing who she really was. The records were devastating. Money from Eleanor's trust had moved through several accounts before reaching an organization connected to a charity Ruth had quietly supported for years. Security logs placed Ruth inside Charles's private study after 2 o'clock in the morning on more than one occasion. Copies of confidential financial documents had been discovered among her belongings, documents Charles had never given her permission to touch. Then came the detail Charles could not explain away. One of the largest transfers had apparently been approved using private authorization information known to only a handful of people. Ruth knew his schedule. She knew where he kept important documents. She knew when he traveled, when he slept, when his daughter visited, and when his office was empty. To Charles, the answer became painfully simple. The woman his family had welcomed into their home had been using their trust against them. But Ruth did something Charles did not expect. She did not beg him to believe her. She did not demand another investigation. She did not raise her voice or accuse anyone else in the room. She reached into her handbag, removed a sealed blue envelope, placed it beside the evidence, and quietly told Charles that one day he would understand why she could not tell him everything. Charles never opened the envelope.
One day you will understand
Anger had
why
already
I left
made the
this
decision
envelope.
for him. In front of the people Ruth had worked beside for more than a decade, he told her that her employment was over and that she was never to enter his home again. Ruth looked toward Allison for a moment, then toward the staircase where a framed photograph of Eleanor still hung above the landing. Something changed in her expression when she saw it. It was not fear. It looked more like disappointment. Then Ruth picked up her suitcase, walked across the marble floor, and stepped through the front doors into the cold November rain. Charles watched until the doors closed behind her. He believed he had just removed a thief from his home. He believed Martin's evidence had protected what remained of Eleanor's legacy. And more than anything, he believed the worst part was finally over. He was wrong, because Ruth had barely been gone 6 hours when Charles's private phone rang. The caller identified herself as an investigator from the bank's fraud division, and within less than a minute she mentioned a transaction Charles had already seen dozens of times. It was the transfer everyone believed Ruth had authorized, but the bank had discovered a problem with the date. The transfer had been authenticated at 10:42 on the night of January 16th. At first, Charles did not understand why that mattered. Then the investigator mentioned the hospital. Charles stopped speaking. January 16th was the night he had been rushed to the emergency room after suffering severe chest pain at home. Ruth had been the person who found him. Ruth had ridden with him to the hospital. Ruth had remained there while doctors examined him, and hospital records placed her beside him until well after midnight. There were cameras, admission records, nurses who remembered her. If those records were correct, Ruth could not have been inside Charles's mansion authorizing that transfer at 10:42. She could not have been using his computer. She could not have been moving Eleanor's money. Someone else had done it. And suddenly the question was no longer whether Ruth had betrayed Charles. The question was who had gone to extraordinary lengths to make Charles believe that she had. But there was another question Charles did not yet know he needed to ask. Why had Eleanor apparently begun documenting strange financial activity years before her death? And why had she trusted Ruth with information she had never shared with her own husband? By the time Charles finally reached for the blue envelope Ruth had left behind, the first person he suspected would be someone inside his own family. The second would be a man he had trusted for almost 30 years. And the truth inside that envelope would force Charles to reconsider almost everything he thought he knew about his wife, his fortune, and the woman he had just thrown out into the rain. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The blue envelope should have made Charles Whitaker question everything. Instead, for 6 hours, it remained unopened on the marble table where Ruth Ellis had left it. And as Charles stood alone in the same entrance hall where he had publicly dismissed her, 3 questions began to trouble him more than the missing $4.8 million. The first was simple, but impossible to ignore. Why had Ruth been entering his private study after midnight? Charles had seen the security records himself. There were nights when the rest of the household was asleep, and Ruth's access card showed her crossing into a room she had no ordinary reason to enter. The second question was even more troubling. Why had investigators found copies of Eleanor Whitaker's trust documents among Ruth's personal belongings? Those papers contained financial information Charles guarded carefully. Ruth was his household manager, not his accountant, attorney, or business advisor. Yet she had apparently been keeping copies for months. And then there was the question that disturbed Charles most of all. Why had Eleanor, before her death, apparently given Ruth instructions Charles had never known existed? At 62, Charles Whitaker had spent most of his adult life believing that enough discipline could protect a man from almost anything. His wealth had bought him an estate outside Greenwich, Connecticut, private transportation, corporate offices overlooking Manhattan, and a company that employed hundreds of people across several states. Employees waited when Charles entered a room. Executives returned his calls within minutes. Lawyers reviewed documents before they ever reached his desk. He had spent decades building a life in which uncertainty was something other people were paid to eliminate. But money had failed him when Eleanor became ill. 4 years after her death, Charles could still enter their bedroom and instinctively glance toward the chair where she once sat reading in the evenings. He could replace furniture, renovate rooms, travel anywhere he wished, but he could not purchase one more conversation with the woman who had understood him better than anyone. After Eleanor died, Charles withdrew from friendships, dinners, and almost every relationship that required him to admit he was lonely. His world became smaller, and the number of people he trusted became smaller with it. There was Allison, his only daughter, 36 years old and still
Father, you
capable of
have to
speaking
reconsider
Charles
this.
in ways
It
that
is not
employees
just about
never
business.
dared.
Allison, I
There was
built this from
Allison's
nothing.
husband,
I will not let
Evan
it fail
Cole,
now. This
an
conversation
ambitious
is over.
40-year-old businessman
I've got this
who had
handled.
spent years trying to prove that he belonged inside
Are you
the
sure?
Whitaker family
Absolutely.
without depending on Charles's
Just as we
money.
planned.
There was Martin Shaw, Charles's 64-year-old attorney, advisor, and friend of almost 30 years. Martin had stood beside Charles during acquisitions, lawsuits, business failures, Eleanor's illness, and the painful months after her funeral. Charles trusted Martin with information he would never place in the hands of ordinary executives. And then there had been Ruth. For 11 years, Ruth had moved through the Whitaker home with such consistency that Charles had stopped thinking of her as someone who simply worked there. She knew which calls he refused during dinner. She knew when Allison was upset before Charles noticed it himself. She remembered Eleanor's anniversaries without mentioning them, understood when Charles wanted company without conversation, and once reacted quickly enough during his medical emergency that doctors later told him the delay of even a short time might have changed the outcome. These were the 4 people Charles believed he understood. One of them, he was beginning to realize, might have been living a very different life from the one Charles saw. And Ruth had known something long before that November morning. 3 months before Charles learned that money was disappearing from Eleanor's trust, Ruth had noticed a small inconsistency almost anyone else would have ignored. An envelope addressed to Charles had arrived with routine financial correspondence. Ruth placed it with his morning papers, as she had done hundreds of times. Later that afternoon, while clearing Charles's study, she noticed the envelope again in the wastebasket. It had been opened, but Charles had spent the entire morning away from the estate. Ruth said nothing. A week later, another document arrived. This time, she remembered the sender. Before Charles returned home, the document disappeared. Soon Ruth began noticing phone calls that ended whenever she entered a room, account statements that appeared in places where they did not belong, and one member of Charles's inner circle asking questions about Eleanor's trust that Ruth believed were far too specific to be casual. She did not confront Charles. She did not confront Martin. She did not tell Allison. Instead, Ruth began keeping notes. What Charles did not know was that 3 months before the first missing millions were discovered, Ruth had already reached a frightening conclusion. Someone Charles trusted completely was lying to him. Long before Charles Whitaker accused Ruth Ellis of stealing millions from his family, she had already done something his fortune could never repay. She had helped keep him alive. That was what made the accusation so difficult to understand later, because Ruth had not entered the Whitaker household as someone seeking influence, money, or access to Charles's private affairs. 11 years earlier, she had arrived at the Connecticut estate as one of several household employees, a 56-year-old widow looking for steady work and a quieter life after years of caring for other families. At first, Charles barely noticed her. He was consumed by Whitaker Industrial Holdings, traveling constantly between Connecticut and New York, while Eleanor managed most matters concerning their home. Ruth cleaned rooms, organized linen closets, prepared guest suites, and handled ordinary responsibilities without demanding attention. But Eleanor noticed something about her almost immediately. Ruth remembered details, not the kind people wrote into calendars, but the details that revealed whether someone was truly paying attention. She remembered which guests made Eleanor uncomfortable, which medication had already been taken, and which family anniversaries Charles routinely forgot. Eleanor gradually began trusting Ruth with responsibilities that went far beyond housekeeping. When Eleanor developed health problems, Ruth learned the schedule of every appointment without being asked twice. She knew which prescription had to be taken with food, which one caused Eleanor to become tired, and which physician Eleanor wanted contacted whenever something changed. Ruth never pretended to be a nurse or doctor. When Eleanor needed medical care, she contacted the appropriate professionals. What made Ruth valuable was her attentiveness. She noticed when Eleanor was quieter than usual. She noticed when certain visitors remained in Charles's study longer than expected. She noticed the way Eleanor sometimes became tense after conversations involving the family trust. Eleanor began asking Ruth to sit nearby while she sorted correspondence, not because Ruth understood complicated financial structures, but because Eleanor trusted her memory. Charles regarded these things as part of the natural order of the house. He was grateful that Eleanor had someone dependable, but he never considered how much Ruth had quietly become part of their daily lives. Years later, he would remember those ordinary moments and realize how much evidence of Ruth's character had been standing directly in front of him. When Eleanor died 4 years before the missing money was discovered, something inside the Whitaker estate changed almost overnight. Charles stopped entertaining friends. Dinner parties disappeared from the calendar. Rooms that had once been filled with Eleanor's voice remained closed for weeks. Allison visited when she could, but she had her own marriage and career. Martin Shaw handled legal matters. Evan Cole occasionally joined Charles for business conversations, but none of them lived inside the quiet that followed Eleanor's death. Ruth did. Every morning, she opened the curtains in Charles's breakfast room even when he ate nothing. She made sure his medication was where he would see it. She kept Eleanor's favorite sitting room exactly as Charles wanted it, refusing to let new employees rearrange photographs he had never found the courage to move. Charles rarely thanked Ruth directly. Gratitude had never come easily to him. Instead, dependence appeared in smaller ways. When Ruth took 3 days away to attend a relative's funeral, Charles complained that nobody prepared his morning schedule correctly. When she returned, he simply nodded and told her there was mail in the study. Ruth understood what he could not say. Then came the night that changed the relationship between them. It was approximately 18 months before Charles discovered the missing millions. Shortly after midnight, most of the mansion was asleep. Ruth had remained downstairs because Charles had returned late from a corporate dinner and left several lights burning in the study. She was heading toward the kitchen when she heard something hit the floor. At first, she assumed Charles had dropped a book. Then came another sound, softer this time. Ruth walked toward the study and found Charles collapsed beside his desk, one hand pressed against his chest, his breathing strained and his face drained of color. For perhaps the first time in years, the man who controlled companies, properties, and hundreds of employees had no control over what was happening to his own body. Ruth did not waste time asking whether he wanted help. She immediately contacted emergency services, followed the instructions she was given, stayed close to Charles, and kept him responsive while help was on the way. Rapid recognition and emergency response can be crucial in serious cardiac events, where even short delays may affect outcomes. www.heart.org. Charles remembered Ruth's voice more clearly than he remembered the paramedics arriving. He remembered opening his eyes and seeing her kneeling beside him. He remembered trying to tell her that he was fine and hearing her refuse to accept it. At the hospital, Ruth stayed until Allison arrived. She remained in the waiting area while doctors examined Charles, and when she finally left, morning light was beginning to appear over Connecticut. Later, Charles was told that Ruth's quick decision to summon help had mattered. He never became sentimental about it. That was not his nature. But several weeks later, without explaining why, he increased Ruth's salary and placed her name on the small list of household employees permitted to contact him directly during emergencies. For Charles, those actions said what he could not comfortably put into words. He trusted her. Ruth had seen him at his weakest and had protected him without hesitation. That memory would remain with him for the next 18 months, which was precisely why what happened afterward would hurt both of them so deeply. Because when investigators eventually placed the financial records in front of Charles, gratitude began competing with evidence. At first, he defended Ruth. When Martin suggested that someone with access to the mansion might have helped move Eleanor's money, Charles dismissed the possibility that Ruth was involved. He reminded Martin who had saved his life. He reminded him that Ruth had served Eleanor faithfully. But then another document appeared. Then another. Access records placed Ruth inside the private study at hours when she claimed to be asleep. Copies of restricted financial papers were discovered among her possessions. A charity Ruth had supported appeared at the end of a chain of questionable transfers. And private authorization information had apparently been used by someone who understood Charles's routines extraordinarily well. Documented fraud cases have repeatedly shown how access, trusted positions, unauthorized transactions, and altered records can make internal theft appear convincing when investigators first reconstruct where money went. Charles kept searching for an explanation that would preserve the woman he thought he knew. Eventually, however, the evidence became so extensive that even the night Ruth saved his life began to feel less like proof of loyalty and more like a memory Charles feared he had misunderstood. Justice Department +2. That was the tragedy of what happened next. Ruth had spent 11 years showing Charles exactly who she was, yet a folder of financial records would eventually persuade him to question all of it. The medications she remembered for Eleanor. The hospital appointments she never missed. The nights she stayed awake when Charles was ill. The morning she remained beside his hospital bed until Allison arrived. Every one of those memories would be weighed against numbers, timestamps, security logs, and documents carrying Ruth's connection. And Charles Whitaker was a man who had built his fortune by believing records before emotions. Ruth knew that better than almost anyone. What Charles could not have known was that the evidence beginning to surround her had not appeared by accident. Someone understood exactly how Charles thought. Someone understood exactly what kind of proof he would trust. And long before Charles ever accused Ruth of betraying him, that person had already begun turning Ruth's greatest strength, her extraordinary access to the Whitaker family, into the very thing that would make her look guilty. 3 months before Charles Whitaker ever heard the words, missing money, Ruth Ellis began doing things that made no sense to anyone watching her. It started with discarded financial correspondence. For years, Ruth had treated Charles's business papers with almost exaggerated respect. Anything marked private went directly onto his desk. Anything thrown away remained in the wastebasket until the office was cleaned. She had never shown curiosity about Whitaker Industrial Holdings, Eleanor's trust, or the complicated financial arrangements surrounding the family. Then, without explanation, Ruth began retrieving certain envelopes Charles had discarded. She would remove them from his study, examine the dates and sender information, and sometimes carry them upstairs instead of placing them with the household recycling. Once, another employee entered the laundry room unexpectedly and found Ruth standing beside a counter with 3 torn financial envelopes spread in front of her. Ruth quickly gathered them together. When asked what she was doing, she offered only a vague explanation that some papers had been thrown away by mistake. It might have meant nothing, but it was the first small change in a woman whose routines had remained almost identical for 11 years. Then came the questions. Ruth had never asked Charles about Eleanor's trust while Eleanor was alive, at least not in any conversation Charles remembered. Suddenly, she wanted to know whether the trust still funded the charitable organizations Eleanor had supported. She asked whether its accounts were reviewed every year. She once casually asked whether Martin Shaw still handled every legal matter connected to it. Charles remembered looking up from his breakfast when she mentioned Martin's name. Ruth seemed to realize she had gone too far and immediately changed the subject. Several days later, Allison heard Ruth asking one of Charles's assistants whether old trust statements were kept digitally or in paper files. Allison mentioned it to her father almost as a joke. Charles dismissed it. Ruth had spent years helping Eleanor organize household correspondence. He reminded her. There could be an innocent explanation, yet even Charles began paying closer attention after that. Ruth had always been interested in people, never money. She remembered birthdays, medications, favorite meals, and family arguments. Now she appeared unusually interested in account statements, legal correspondence, and a trust containing millions of dollars. What troubled Charles most happened late one Thursday evening. He had returned from New York earlier than expected after a dinner meeting was canceled. The estate was unusually quiet. As Charles walked toward his study, he noticed a light beneath the door and heard the faint movement of papers inside. He assumed one of his assistants had stayed late, but when he entered the hallway, Ruth stepped out. She looked surprised to see him. Charles asked why she was still awake. Ruth said she had been putting something away. Then Charles noticed that the bottom drawer of a narrow cabinet beside his study was partially open. Ruth moved toward it and pushed it closed almost immediately. Charles knew that drawer. Eleanor had once used it to store old correspondence, copies of charitable records and documents she wanted kept separate from his corporate files. After Eleanor died, Charles had rarely opened it. He asked Ruth what she had been looking for. She hesitated long enough for the silence itself to become uncomfortable. Then she said only that Eleanor had once asked her to keep certain papers safe. Charles asked which papers. Ruth lowered her eyes and told him they were personal. Charles could have demanded an answer that night. Instead, he let her leave. 11 years of loyalty bought Ruth something very few people in Charles Whitaker's world received, the benefit of the doubt. Still, the incident remained with him. The next morning, Charles opened Eleanor's old drawer himself. Nothing appeared obviously missing. There were letters, receipts, charity acknowledgments, and folders he had not looked through since his wife's death. But one thing bothered him. Several documents had clearly been moved recently. Dust lines on the wooden surface showed where folders had been shifted. Charles stood there for several minutes before closing the drawer. He said nothing to Ruth. Ruth said nothing to him. From that point forward, however, their relationship changed in a way neither acknowledged. Charles began noticing when she entered certain rooms. Ruth began checking whether he was nearby before handling paperwork. Sometimes Charles caught her watching Martin during his visits to the estate. At other times, she seemed nervous whenever Evan Cole appeared unexpectedly. There was enough unusual behavior to create suspicion, but not enough to explain what Ruth was actually doing. The first person to place a number beside that suspicion was Martin Shaw. One afternoon, Martin asked Charles to speak privately. He closed the study door, placed a small stack of financial records on Charles's desk, and told him that Eleanor's family trust contained irregular transactions that required attention. The first amount was $20,000. Charles barely reacted. A trust of that size routinely moved larger sums. Martin explained that the amount itself was not the concern. The payment had been categorized as a charitable distribution, yet the documentation did not perfectly match previous grants. Several weeks later came another transaction for $75,000. That money passed through an entity Charles did not immediately recognize before being listed as part of another charitable payment. Martin initially wondered whether it was an accounting mistake. Then he found more. $140,000, $280,000. Another transfer slightly above $400,000. The pattern stretched across months and involved entities whose names were similar enough to legitimate organizations that a casual review might not have raised alarm. Real U.S. fraud cases have documented trusted insiders using unauthorized transfers, shell entities, false statements, and falsified accounting or bank records to conceal the movement of entrusted funds, which is why the mechanics Charles was being shown seemed frighteningly plausible. Justice Department +2. Charles's first reaction was anger, but not at Ruth. He wanted to know why nobody had noticed sooner. Martin explained that the transactions were separated by enough time, divided across different amounts, and accompanied by documentation that appeared legitimate when viewed individually. Only after examining them together did the pattern become visible. Charles ordered Martin to tell no one, not Allison, not Evan, not the company's senior executives. He did not want rumors moving through the family before they knew whether they were dealing with theft, bookkeeping errors, or unauthorized decisions made by someone who believed they were acting on Eleanor's wishes. Martin agreed and promised to investigate quietly. For the next several days, Charles continued his routine while studying everyone around him differently. When Allison visited, he wondered whether she knew something. When Evan called about an investment matter, Charles listened more carefully than usual. When Ruth entered his breakfast room carrying coffee, he found himself looking at her hands and remembering the envelopes she had collected. Nothing had been proven. But for the first time in 11 years, Charles wondered whether loyalty could simply be another performance. Martin returned 6 days later carrying a much larger folder. This time, he did not sit down immediately. He told Charles that the questionable transactions had moved through multiple accounts before reaching different beneficiaries, but one destination kept appearing near the edge of the paper trail. It was a charitable organization Ruth had supported privately for years. Charles knew about it. Eleanor had once donated to the same organization after Ruth mentioned its work. Ruth had attended fundraising events connected to it. She had even used several vacation days to volunteer there. Martin was careful not to accuse her directly. He simply placed the records in front of Charles and allowed the connection to speak for itself. Charles stared at Ruth's name beside an old charitable disclosure form, then at the questionable transactions, then back again. It was possible the connection was innocent. It was possible someone knew about Ruth's association and was using it deliberately. But it was also possible that Charles had spent 11 years trusting a woman whose financial life he knew almost nothing about. And suddenly the late-night visits to his study, the copied correspondence, the questions about Eleanor's trust, and the drawer Ruth had hurriedly closed no longer looked like unrelated moments. That evening, Charles sat alone in the study long after the household had gone quiet. Martin's folder remained open in front of him. He wanted to reject what the documents suggested. Ruth had saved his life. She had cared for Eleanor. She had remained after Eleanor's death when Charles himself had barely known how to continue living inside that house. But Charles had also spent decades in business learning that trust and proof were not the same thing. People could be generous and still have secrets. They could appear loyal while needing money. They could justify taking something because they believed they deserved it. And Charles did not know Ruth's finances. He did not know whether she had debts, obligations, or relatives asking for help. He did not know why she had suddenly become interested in a trust worth millions. Most troubling of all, he still did not know why she had been searching through Eleanor's papers after midnight. Charles closed Martin's folder and made a decision that would change everything. He would not accuse Ruth. Not yet. He would watch her. And what he discovered next would make the case against her appear almost impossible to deny. If this story has captured your interest and you're eager to discover what happens next, let us know in the comment section. Don't forget to tell us where you're watching from. Also, hit the subscribe button so you don't miss the next part and find out who the real betrayer was.